Amar Patnaik.
Thank you, sir. So the resolution that has been moved, it largely talks about air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, and what has been discussed also largely speaks about its impact on health of human beings. No denying the fact that it does impact health of human beings to a large extent. So today is the Human Rights Day. Fortunately, today we are discussing this topic. Right to health, right to life is essentially a basic human rights, and therefore is so apt that we are discussing today. But I am going to go beyond the pollution aspect of climate change, because it is only a microscopic element of the entire issue of climate change. The entire issue of climate change includes deforestation, ecological imbalance, human practices, extension activities in various sectors. Unless we address the entire thing in its entirety, the issue of climate change, of which pollution is an element, cannot be addressed. Before getting into that, one of the most important aspects of the impact of climate change in exacerbating some of the inequities in society is something that I want to point out. We already have social inequities, economic and wealth inequities, income inequities. In any climate change or any climate-related disaster, the poorest are always affected the most. The statistics says that the risk to the poor are twice than of the rich. Not only do they account for most casualties, they also suffer from wage and job loss. Farmers suffer from low incomes due to damage to crops, and poor people lose their houses. Let us look at the cyclone Yash. It made 150,000 people homeless. The cyclone Amphan, 13 million people were affected and $13 billion in damage after its landfall. These are having long-term impacts on societies and particularly the poor people. The 70% of Indian household depends on agriculture, and therefore any climate change affects them enormously. The urban poor is also affected. Climate change is already affecting the poverty reduction process. It is slowing down our fight against poverty reduction and increasing inequality in India. Unfortunately, the direct link between climate change-induced inequity has not been studied to the extent it is required. And therefore, there is merit in what my Honorable MP, Madam AmeeYajnik said about having all stakeholders being brought together under one roof to discuss the issue. So, the Brundtland Commission, which successfully unified environmentalism with social and economic concerns and put it on the development agenda, said one very important thing, that it requires a holistic approach. You cannot consider ecological or climate change issues by divorcing it from social and economic dimensions. All aspects of the human civilization has to be accepted, has to be covered if you want to address the issue of climate change. So the interesting thing about environment is that it is a commons. What we call in economics as commons. And there is a concept called tragedy of the commons. Everybody thinks that he has nothing to lose. And that is where the problem is. Elinor Ostrom one scientist, political scientist who got the Nobel Prize in economics, has worked extensively on this. In fact, she says that the whole problem of governing the commons is due to competition. What is required is cooperation. Cooperation amongst communities, amongst societies, amongst castes, amongst religions, amongst people, amongst everybody in the society, rich and the poor. So what I would like to end today in this entire discourse is talk about some principles based on this issue of the tragedy of the commons. The principle says we have to talk about cooperation. We cannot talk about competition. All our laws, all our developmental schemes are geared towards competition. Unless communities in villages cooperate to take care of their commons, which includes the environment, no change can take place. We have to go for localization, not centralization. I'm not saying it alone. The World Bank has repeatedly said. And when we are talking about sustainability development goals, there is no point having goals at the national level or at the subnational level. The people who have to internalize these sustainability development goals are the people living in the households in villages. We have to make efforts to make people internalize these goals at the village level, localize these practices, and only then the impact of climate change can be reduced. People will change their practices and behaviors, and that will only bring about change. Remember, coercive policies, regulatory mechanisms can only achieve this much. It is only a change in the cultural cognitive frame that brings permanent change. And that is what is the call of the hour. We have to talk about action, not about speech. We have to think long term. We cannot think about short-term measures. This is another principle that we have to follow in any discussion on climate change. We have to talk about selflessness. We cannot talk about selfishness. The entire paradigm of development currently rests on the philosophy of selfishness. And that is why I was not surprised when I read about Gandhi's quote. It says, "The world has enough for everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed." And that is precisely the point that I am making, that some people, the rich, the well-endowed, they will have to sacrifice some of their industrial growth maybe, some of their human needs maybe, to satisfy the needs of the poor. If each one goes in their own way, then we cannot achieve climate change. The last principle is someone has to sacrifice. And someone has to sacrifice what? Sacrifice greed. When we talk about the 3R principles, reduce, reuse, and recycle, our emphasis in all my 28 years of career in bureaucracy has been, or in my life, you would all agree, is to emphasize on the last 2 R's, which is recycle, reuse. The entire concept of circular economy comes from there. But what about reduce? The initial reduction of waste, initial reduction of needs is at the root of a solution, a permanent solution to achieving climate change goals. I completely agree that governments after governments, our Honorable Prime Minister's goal of renewable energy of solar energy of 450 gigawatts is really praiseworthy and laudable. Our Chief Minister, Naveen Patnaik, said that we need to have long-term disaster-resilient infrastructure instead of having every year incremental outgoes from the SDRF to attend to a particular post-disaster cyclone situation. These long-term measures are necessary if we think that we can tackle the issue of climate change. I have a very interesting quote from Al Gore, who has worked extensively on the issue of climate change. He says, there remains a yawning gap between long-term climate goals and near-term action plans. Large emitters must increase their climate ambitions with renewed credibility and urgency. Likewise, developing countries urgently need substantial support on vaccine access, climate finance, and debt relief. These are the sacrifice aspects that the developed world has to do, which they are not willing to do. The entire commitment that was made by the developed world of supporting climate change action and therefore funding climate finance of the developing countries in the Paris Accord has not been adhered to. Despite this, India has taken the lead in India has taken the lead in ensuring a climate change, a climate resilient, a climate sustainable development path. The problem is, India alone cannot do it. As I said, communities world over, people who are not having basic amenities of life in Africa would want that amenities to come by, and that has to come by the sacrifice of the developed world. That is not happening. In India, we have laws relating to air pollution, laws relating to water pollution, laws relating to biodegradable waste, laws relating to plastic waste, but we do not have a comprehensive legislation to address the issue of climate change. Why I am saying it is to reinforce my first point, that unless community participates in the process of climate change, internalizes the process of sustainability in their daily lives, we cannot achieve the goal of climate resilient growth. That is our dream. For that, I think what the resolution says of a JPC, the structures, institutional structures, we have the Standing Committee on Climate Change, Forest and Climate Change. We have the Consultative Committee on Forest and Climate Change. I think more important than the institutions, what is important is to involve the stakeholders, and each one of us in this room, in this parliament, in this any position of power, have to ensure that we internalize the principle of reduction, reuse, and recycling. We have to go back to the drawing boards to practice the path of circular economy in a major way. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you. Next speaker, Sri V. Vijay Sai Reddy.
Thank you, Vice Chairman, sir. Sir,